I want you to close your eyes for a moment. We're going to do something a little different to start this deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
We are dialing the clock back, way back, to roughly 715 BCE. And I want you to picture the Rome you see in the movies. Forget the white marble columns, the paved roads, the guys in pristine togas debating philosophy.
Right, erase all of that. We are in the Iron Age. It's dirty, it's dark, it's desperate, and the sun is just going down over the Italian peninsula. It's twilight.
You're standing on a hill, looking down into a dusty valley. There are thatched huts, mud walls, the smell of wood smoke and livestock. And in the middle of this settlement, there is a festival happening. It's loud, there's music, shouting, people drinking. But then the tone shifts.
It shifts instantly. The music stops, the shouting changes from, celebration to panic.
In the middle of this chaos, I want you to focus on one person. We actually know her name from the historical record, or at least the name the legends preserved. Hercilia.
Hercilia.
She's young, maybe 23. She's the daughter of a nobleman from a neighboring town. And right now, she is terrified. She's being dragged through the dirt. Her sandals are scraping against the ground. She's screaming for her mother, and she's being hauled toward a hut she's never seen by a man she doesn't know.
It's such a visceral image, and what makes it so chilling isn't just the physical violence, though that is obviously horrific, it's the context. Hercilia didn't wake up that morning expecting a war.
No.
She woke up expecting a party, she put on her best clothes, she walked to this neighboring town with her parents thinking she was a guest, she thought she was safe. She had no idea that she was walking into a trap that would end with her never seeing her childhood home again.
And this is the part that really stopped me cold when we were digging through the source material for this deep dive. What is happening to Hercilia in this nightmare scenario, the screaming, the physical dragging, the desperate clinging to her mother, that isn't just a crime scene?
No, it's not.
That is a blueprint.
It's the script.
Yeah.
That is the most disturbing realization.
Because for the next 1,000 years, a millennium, every single traditional Roman wedding would reenact this exact moment.
That is the part that is so hard for the modern mind to wrap itself around. The terror that Hercilia felt wasn't something the Romans tried to hide or, shamefully bury. It was ritualized. It became the definition of the proper way to get married. And the screaming wasn't a bug, it was a feature.
So that is our mission for this deep dive. We are taking a hard look at the event often romantically called the rape of the Sabine women. Though, and we'll get into this, abduction or mass seizure is a much more accurate translation of the Latin raptio.
Yes, that's a key distinction.
We're going to deconstruct how this founding crime of Western civilization was systematically erased, turned into high art, and then codified into traditions that we still recognize today.
And I have to set the stakes here, because we aren't just talking about ancient history trivia. We are talking about the DNA of Western marriage traditions. If you have ever seen a groom carry a bride over a threshold, or watched a father give away his daughter at the altar, or even heard the chaotic noise of a wedding party leaving a reception,
You're seeing the echoes.
you are seeing the echoes of this specific night in 750 BCE.
Exactly. The source material we have today, Livy, Plutarch, Dionysius, is frankly disturbing, but is also incredibly eye-opening. The thesis here is simple but heavy. Once you hear this history, you are never going to look at a traditional wedding ceremonies the same way again.
I think that's a guarantee.
So let's unpack this. We have to start with the setting, the scene of the crime, so to speak.
Yeah.
Because like we said, this isn't the Rome of Caesar yet.
Not even close. If you look at the archaeological record and the early histories, specifically the historian Livy, the Rome of 750 BCE is basically a shanty town on a hill. It's a collection of mud huts surrounded by a rudimentary wall. But the most important thing to understand is the demographics.
Right, because Livy doesn't describe it as a kingdom initially. He uses a very specific, very loaded word to describe what Romulus built. He calls it an asylum.
Yes, an asylum. Now, we need to pause on that word, because today, when we hear asylum, we think of, well, a psychiatric institution or maybe a political legal status. But in the ancient Greek and Roman world, an asylum, or asileus, was a religious concept. It refers to a sanctuary, usually a sacred grove or a temple precinct, where a person was inviolable.
Inviolable meaning you couldn't touch them without angering the god.
Exactly. If you dragged someone out of an asylum, you were committing a sacrilege. It was a divine no-go zone. So Romulus, the legendary founder, he designates a specific spot between two groves on the Capitoline Hill, and he declares it an asylum. He opens the gates and says, essentially, if you can make it here, you are safe. No questions asked.
Which is a massive neon sign for a very specific type of person. I mean, who packs up their life and runs to a mud hut settlement in a mosquito-infested valley.
People who are running away from something. Livy is uncomfortably honest about this, which I appreciate. He lists the people who showed up. He calls it a turba, a mob.
A mob.
A mob. You had runaway slaves fleeing their masters. And you have to understand, a runaway slave in the ancient world, if caught, would be crucified or branded on the forehead.
So it's a life or death decision.
Absolutely. Then you had men fleeing murder charges in their hometowns. You had debtors who were about to be sold into debt bondage, which was a huge issue in the ancient world. If you couldn't pay your debts, you became the property of your creditor.
So if you stayed home, you were going to be executed or enslaved.
Yeah.
If you ran to Rome, you got a fresh start.
Precisely. It was a city of second chances, but that also meant it was a city of the desperate, the criminal, and the unwanted. Exiles, fugitives, the whole lot.
It's a settlement of fugitives.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically the ancient equivalent of a pirate colony or a frontier outlaw town.
That's a great analogy. It's Deadwood on the Tiber. It's a place with no past, only a future, and that attracts a certain kind of man, an aggressive, ambitious, probably violent kind of man.
And because of who was running, runaway slaves, fugitives, debtors, the population was overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, male.
Right. Women in that society didn't have the same mobility or reasons to flee alone, so you end up with this testosterone-fueled camp.
And this leads to the existential crisis that drives this whole story. We call it the single-generation problem.
It's simple biology, isn't it? You can build walls, you can build temples, you can steal cattle and amass wealth, but if you have no women, you have no children. And if you have no children, your city has a shelf life of exactly 1 generation.
It's a ticking clock.
It is. Romulus looked at his new settlement, this bustling, aggressive camp of men, and realized he was presiding over a ghost town in the making.
It's a demographic dead end.
Exactly. In 30 or 40 years, when these men died of old age or battle, the roofs would collapse, the walls would crumble, and the neighbors would just reclaim the hills. Rome would be a historical footnote, a failed experiment.
So Romulus tries to solve this the civilized first. He doesn't go straight to violence.
No, to his credit, he tries diplomacy.
Okay.
He sends ambassadors out to the neighboring tribes, the Sabines, the Latins, the people living in the established towns nearby. These are communities that have been there for centuries. They have families, lineages, religious structures. They're old money, so to speak.
And what's the offer?
The Roman ambassadors propose a formal treaty. They ask for connubium, the legal right of intermarriage.
They basically knock on the door and say, hey, we're new to the neighborhood. Can our men marry your daughters?
And the response was brutal. It wasn't just a polite no, it was a mockery. Livy records that the neighbors asked the ambassadors, why didn't you open an asylum for women too? Then you'd have a matching set.
Ouch. That is a sick burn in 750 BCE.
It is. They were calling them out. They were saying, we know who you are. You're slaves and criminals. Why would we give our daughters to a runaway slave? Why would we mix our good, respectable blood with yours?
You know, it's easy to look at the neighbors as being snobs, but when you frame it like that,
Yeah.
if a group of convicts set up a camp down the road from my house and asked to date my daughter, I'd probably lock the doors too.
It was a completely rational security assessment, wasn't it? The Sabines looked at Rome and saw a gang, not a state. You don't make treaties with a gang. But there was also a strategic element to the rejection. The neighbors realized that Rome was vulnerable.
Because of the demographic strangulation?
Right. They didn't even have to fight a war to destroy Rome. They just had to wait. If they quarantined the city, if everyone in the region agreed not to trade with them, not to marry them, Rome would die of natural causes. It was a containment strategy.
Let them wither on the vine.
Exactly. So Romulus is backed into a corner. His diplomacy has failed. He's being mocked. And he knows the clock is ticking on his city's survival.
And this is the pivot point.
This is where everything changes. Romulus gathers his advisors, probably the toughest, scariest guys in the asylum, and he asks the question that changes Western history. He asks, if our neighbors will not give us their daughters willingly, how else might we acquire them?
And the answer obviously wasn't, let's try flowers and chocolates.
No, the answer was a military operation disguised as a party.
This brings us to part 2, the trap. I think this is important because it shows the premeditation. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a drunken brawl.
No, this was a tactical operation, a psychological operation, or a psyop. in modern terms. Romulus knows he can't just raid the neighboring towns. If he marches an army out, the neighbors will see them coming, hide the women, and fight back. He needs to bring the targets to him.
Lure them in.
Precisely. So he announces a festival.
Okay, what's the cover story?
He announces the Consuelia. He claims to have discovered an altar to the god Consus, an ancient agricultural deity, god of the granary, the harvest, and secrets.
The god of secrets. How fitting.
Oh, the irony is thick. He sends out heralds to all the towns that had just rejected him, the Canenses, the Christumini, the Antemnates, and especially the Sabanes, who were the most powerful neighbors.
And the invitation had to be incredibly persuasive to get these people to come back after they just insulted him.
It was a masterclass in marketing. The invitation promised 3 specific things. First, spectacular entertainment, horse races, foot races, boxing. In the ancient world, a big festival was rare. It was like the Super Bowl and Coachella combined. It's a huge deal.
It's a major draw.
A huge draw. Second, he explicitly stated that it was safe for families. Women and children were invited. This was key. It signaled this is not a military gathering. And third, he invoked the peace of the gods.
I want to dig into that peace of the gods bit. That's not just a slogan, right?
No, it's a religious contract. In antiquity, a religious festival is a sacred truce. You do not bring weapons. You do not engage in violence. To spill blood at a festival is to pollute the sanctuary and invite the wrath of the gods. By declaring a festival, Romulus was essentially swearing a holy oath that everyone would be safe.
It's the ultimate guarantee.
It should have been.
So the Sabines, thinking, well, they wouldn't dare anger the gods, they accept.
They accept. Curiosity played a big role, too. Livy notes that they wanted to see what these criminals had built. They wanted to inspect the new city. So they came in droves, whole families, fathers, mothers, children, and specifically the unmarried daughters.
They walked right into the spider's web.
They did. And imagine the scene. You're a Sabine girl. You're walking with your parents. You arrive unarmed, dressed in your festival best. You walk through the gates of Rome. You see the new houses, the walls. Livy says they were actually impressed.
So the deception is working.
Perfectly. They're probably thinking, okay, this isn't as bad as we thought. Maybe they are civilized.
The ultimate deception.
Exactly. They gather in the valley, what would later become the Circus Maximus. They're sitting on the grass watching the games. The Roman men are mixing in with the crowd, chatting, being friendly hosts. The wine is flowing. The atmosphere is relaxed. Romulus is sitting on a high chair watching.
And then the signal.
This is part 3, the seizure. And again, we have to debunk the popular myth here. If you look at later paintings, it looks like a riot. It looks like the men just got drunk, got horny, and lost control.
The boys will be boys defense.
That's exactly what it is. But the history tells a colder, much more calculated story.
It was a coordinated strike.
It was military precision. Romulus stood up. He adjusted his toga. Some sources say he folded it a specific way or stood up and sat down again. That was the signal. Suddenly the music stopped. And at that exact moment, every Roman man in the crowd drew a concealed weapon, maybe a dagger, maybe just their fists, and lunged.
But they weren't attacking the men.
No, the order was specific. Do not kill the men unless they resist. Grab the women. And not just any women, specifically the marriageable virgins.
You mentioned earlier that there was even a hierarchy to this kidnapping. That really blew my mind. Even in this chaotic abduction, there was a class system.
Oh, absolutely. This is Rome. Everything has a class system. The majority of the Roman men, the plebeians, they just grabbed the nearest woman they could find. It was a scramble.
A free-for-all.
A complete free-for-all. But the sources tell us that the most beautiful women, the ones who were considered the highest prizes, had been scouted out beforehand.
They were pre-selected.
Yes, they were marked targets. And they weren't grabbed by the senators themselves, the powerful men. The leading senators, the patres, had assigned squads of plebeians, communals, to secure these specific women and carry them to their houses.
It's so dehumanizing. It turns these women into luxury goods to be delivered.
It does. Livy writes, some were carried to their houses by plebeians who had been specifically assigned this task. It wasn't passion, it was procurement, it was logistics.
And the scale of this crime, we aren't talking about 20 or 30 people.
The numbers vary. Some ancient sources say 30, some say 500. The most commonly cited number in the tradition is around 700 women. But Valerius Antius, another historian, he gives this oddly specific number, exactly 527. Whatever the precise number, we are talking about hundreds of families ripped apart in minutes.
And the Sabine men, the fathers and brothers.
They were helpless. Remember, they respected the peace of the gods. They were unarmed. Suddenly, thousands of armed Romans are turning on them. They had to run. They had to flee the city to save their own lives, leaving their daughters screaming behind them. Livy describes them shouting curses at Romulus, calling on the god Consus to witness this betrayal of hospitality.
The god of the festival will witness this.
Exactly, but Romulus didn't care. He had what he wanted. The gates were slammed shut, the fathers were outside, the daughters were inside.
And this brings us to what I think is the most disturbing but also the most fascinating part of this deep dive, the aha moment. Because usually when a nation commits a crime like this, a mass abduction, they try to hide it.
They rewrite it.
Or they rename it. But the Romans didn't just remember it, they reenacted it.
This is where we connect the trauma to the tradition. And it's not a modern interpretation. Roman historians like Festus and Livy, writing hundreds of years later, explicitly state that the wedding rituals of their own time, the rituals performed by Augustus and Caesar and ordinary citizens, were pantomimes of this specific night.
So let's walk through these rituals. We have 6 of them in our notes, and I want to really look at the psychology behind them. The first one is the rapio.
A rapio. It's the root of our word rape, but in this context it means seizure or snatching. In a traditional Roman wedding, the ceremony didn't end with a kiss. It ended with the bride sitting on her mother's lap. The groom and his friends would then approach, and on a cue, they would physically tear the bride away from the mother.
We're talking about a staged struggle. It wasn't gentle.
No, not at all. The mother was supposed to hold on, the bride was supposed to cling to her, and the groom had to use physical force to separate them. It wasn't supposed to look gentle. It was supposed to look like a kidnapping. Festus is explicit. This ritual commemorates the violence used against the Sabine women.
It effectively says marriage is an act of taking.
Exactly. It frames the husband as the conqueror and the wife as the prize. It starts the marriage with an act of symbolic violence.
Ritual number 2, the carrying.
This follows the seizure. In a Roman wedding, it was considered bad luck for a bride to walk to her new home on her own 2 feet. She was often lifted or carried in a procession. Why?
Because the Sabine women didn't walk willingly.
They didn't walk willingly into the homes of their captors. They were dragged or carried. So if a bride walked, it would imply she wanted to go, which would break the historical reenactment.
It memorializes the lack of consent.
Precisely. It emphasizes that she's being transported as property, not moving as an agent. Her feet are not supposed to touch the ground of her own volition.
Ritual number 3, the torchlight procession. Now, I know they use torches at weddings, even in the middle of the day.
They did. You could get married at high noon in July, in blazing sunlight, and you'd still have a procession with torches. Why? Because the original raid happened at twilight. It went into the evening. The Sabine women were dragged through the confusing, dark streets of the asylum, seeing only the flickering torches of their captors.
It's like a sensory reenactment.
It is. So every bride for the next 1,000 years had to take that same journey through the darkness symbolically.
It's incredible how they were obsessed with getting the lighting right for the reenactment. It's like, we need to set the mood of the original trauma.
It's trauma theater. They were preserving the sensory details of the crime, the sights, the sounds, the feeling of being carried.
Ritual number 4. This is the one that really hit me because it's so common today. The threshold.
The famous carrying the bride over the threshold.
Right. If you ask someone today why we do that, they'll say, oh, it's bad luck if she trips, or it's romantic to sweep her off her feet.
That's the sanitized Victorian explanation. The Roman explanation is much darker and, honestly, more logical. The bride was lifted over the threshold because, historically, that was the moment of finality. That was the moment the Sabine woman was brought inside the captor's house and the door was shut.
The prison door closing.
Exactly. Once she is over that threshold, she is in his domain. The outside world, her father, her freedom, her past, is gone. It symbolizes the impossibility of escape. She doesn't walk in because no prisoner walks willingly into their cell. She is placed there.
It changes the whole vibe of that gesture. It goes from, I'm protecting you, to I'm incarcerating you.
It's a symbol of containment. It is the final act of the seizure.
Ritual number 5, the sham resistance.
This is the psychological component. We have texts that say Roman brides were expected, even required, to cry during the wedding.
Required to cry.
Yes. If a bride looked happy or eager, she was considered shameless. To be a virtuous Roman bride, you had to perform terror, you had to weep, you had to look back at your parents' house, you had to scream.
Because the original women were terrified. Their terror was genuine.
Exactly. The genuine, raw terror of those 700 Sabine women became the correct etiquette for a bride. Their real screams became a script. If you weren't screaming, you weren't honoring the tradition, you were being improper.
It's so twisted. It forces every woman to perform the worst moment of her ancestors' lives as a sign of virtue.
It's a psychological burden placed on every single bride.
And finally, ritual number 6, the shout, tellatio.
This one is a great piece of linguistic archaeology. At Roman weddings, people would shout, "Tellatio." It was like their version of shouting congratulations or clinking glasses. But even by the time of Livy, people had forgotten why they shouted it.
But Livy dug up the origin.
He did. He records that during the seizure, there was a particularly stunning woman being dragged away by a group of commoners. Other men were trying to cut in and take her, so the commoners started shouting, "Tellatio! Tellatio!" which means she is for Telasius.
And Telasius was a VIP.
He was a well-known, powerful nobleman. So by shouting his name, they were basically putting a reserve sign on her. Back off! She's property of a powerful man. It was a claim of ownership. And it worked. The crowd parted.
So the wedding cheer isn't best wishes, it's this woman is claimed property.
It commemorates the successful establishment of ownership. It's a property claim shouted as a celebration.
So we have these 6 rituals: the seizure, the carrying, the torches, the threshold, the sham resistance, and the shout. They are all bricks in the wall of this cultural memory. But let's go back to the narrative, because the story doesn't end with the door slamming shut.
No. The seizure is just the beginning of the crisis. Now you have 700 terrified women locked in the houses of strange men, and you have an enraged army forming outside the city. Rome has to manage the fallout.
This brings us to part 5, the justification. Because you can't just steal 700 women and not have a PR strategy. And Romulus, for all his faults, was a genius politician.
He was a master manipulator. The day after the abduction, the women are distraught. They are refusing to eat. They are weeping. Romulus goes from house to house. He visits them personally. And he gives a speech that Livy records, which is frankly a masterclass in gaslighting.
How does he spin this?
First, he blames the victims' families. He tells the women, "This is your father's fault. They were too proud. We asked nicely for intermarriage, and they insulted us. They forced our hand. We had to do this."
That is classic abuser logic. Look what you made me do.
It is timeless. He shifts the blame from the perpetrator to the protector. If your fathers had just been reasonable, this could have been a nice wedding. But they weren't, so here we are.
And then he pivots to the romance angle.
He does. He promises them that they will be treated well. He says they will share in the citizenship of Rome, share in the property, and most emotionally manipulative of all, they will be the mothers of free men. But then he gives them a command. He says, "Give your hearts to those to whom chance has given your bodies."
To whom chance has given your bodies. Just what?
Pause on that phrasing. He doesn't say, "To whom we have given your bodies," or "to whom I forced you." He blames chance, fate. It's passive voice. He's acknowledging that the giving of the body, the physical act, is already done. It's a non-consensual reality. But now he is demanding their emotional labor too.
Your bodies are already ours, so you might as well give us your minds too.
You might as well fall in love because it's the only way you'll be happy. It is the ultimate captive argument.
Talk about a captive audience. Did it work?
Not immediately, and this is where we have to talk about the war, because the Sabine fathers didn't just walk away. They went home, they mourned, and then they organized.
But it took time, didn't it?
It took months, and this delay is crucial. During those months, the women are living with the Romans. Some of them become pregnant, children are born. The shock of the abduction begins to wear off and is replaced by the mundane reality of daily life.
Stockholm Syndrome.
We have to be careful using modern psychological terms, but yes, the dynamic is similar. It's adaptation to captivity. It's building a life in an impossible situation. But eventually, the Sabines return. They march on Rome with a massive army. They betray the Roman guard at the citadel, thanks to Tarpeia, another tragic female figure in this story, and they seize the high ground.
So now the Romans are in the valley, the Forum, and the Sabines are on the hill. And they clash.
It's a bloodbath. Livy describes it as a stalemate. The Romans are fighting for their existence. The Sabines are fighting for their honor and their children. Men are dying on both sides. And this leads to the climax of the story, the intervention.
The famous painting. The women rushing onto the battlefield.
Yes. But we have to rigorously deconstruct the Hollywood version of this. The popular myth is that the women ran out because they'd fallen in love with their rugged Roman husbands and wanted to save them.
Please don't hurt my husband. I love him.
That's the version Rome wanted us to believe. But look at the text. Look at the speeches Livy attributes to them. It wasn't love. It was what we might call the mathematics of tragedy.
Walk us through that, math.
Imagine you are Hersilia. You run onto the battlefield. Your hair is torn out, your clothes are ripped. You are holding an infant, your child, but also the child of your captor. You look at one side of the field and you see your father. You look at the other side and you see your husband.
If your father wins?
If your father wins, he kills your husband. Your child becomes fatherless, you become a widow, and you are dragged back to a home that you no longer belong to, carrying the child of the enemy. You are now a pariah.
And if your husband wins?
If your husband wins, he kills your father. You become an orphan. Your husband's hands are stained with your father's blood. How do you live with that, man?
There is no winning scenario.
Zero. They stopped the war because they had no good options left. Listen to what they shout. They don't shout, "We love you." They shout about guilt. They scream at their fathers, "Do not stain your hands with the blood of a son-in-law." They scream at their husbands, "Do not stain your hands with the blood of a father-in-law."
They are warning them about parricide,
Yeah.
family murder.
Yes. They're saying, if you keep fighting, you're polluting the family line. And then they offer themselves up. They say, if you regret this union, turn your anger on us. We are the cause of this war. We are the cause of wounds and death to our husbands and fathers. Better for us to die than to live as widows or orphans.
That is chilling. They're essentially acting as human shields. They're saying, kill us because we are the problem.
It's not a romantic gesture. It's a suicidal gesture born of total desperation. They're positioning themselves as the physical embodiment of the trauma, and it shocks the men into silence. The sheer horror of it stops the battle cold.
It works.
It works. The fighting stops. The generals Romulus and the Sabine king Titus Tatius meet in the middle, and they agree to a peace treaty. But not just a peace treaty. They agree to merge the two nations.
The famous reconciliation.
Rome framed it as reconciliation. But for the women, think about what that merger means.
It means the escape road is closed.
Forever. If the Sabines had won, the women might have gone home. If the Romans had won, they would have remained captives. But with a merger, their fathers move into the city, their families surrender and join the community of the kidnappers. The captivity becomes permanent because the outside world has now moved inside. There's nowhere left to go.
It's a surrender disguised as a reunion.
Exactly. And once the merger happens, the machine of erasure turns on. This is part 6. Because a state cannot be built on the open memory of a crime. You have to clean up the narrative.
You have to make it look like it was all for the best.
Rome developed brilliant strategies for this. One was political honors. Romulus divided the growing population into 30 voting districts called curiae, and he named these districts after the Sabine women.
Which sounds like a huge honor. We're naming the Constitution after you.
It's a trap. It's a brilliant political trap. By naming the districts after them, he frames them as founding mothers. He weaves them into the legitimacy of the state. If a woman complains, "I was kidnapped," the state can say, "How can you say that? You are a pillar of our society. The voting wards are named after you."
It forces them to be complicit in their own story's sanitization.
Yes. You cannot be a victim if you are an icon. It's a way of silencing dissent by smothering it in honors.
And speaking of icons, we have to talk about what happened to Hercilia specifically.
The ultimate erasure. Hercilia eventually dies, and according to the mythology, she doesn't just pass away, she is deified. She becomes a goddess named Hora.
And what is she the goddess of? Let me guess, something ironic.
She becomes the goddess of, wait for it, the sanctity of marriage.
You have to be kidding me. That's just cruel.
I wish I was. The victim of the most famous mass abduction in history becomes the divine patron of the institution that victimized her.
The irony is suffocating.
It's not just irony, it's propaganda. Future Roman brides would go to the temple of Hora and pray for a happy marriage. They were unknowingly praying to a woman whose own marriage started with her screaming in the dirt. But by making her a goddess, the Romans stripped her of her humanity and her suffering. A goddess doesn't scream. A goddess smiles.
The source material we looked at identifies 4 specific techniques Rome used to hide this crime. I want to run through them because, honestly, they feel very modern. Like PR strategies we see corporations or governments use today.
They are timeless strategies of power. Strategy 1, emphasize eventual consent. They said no at first, but they eventually said yes. This implies that the initial no doesn't count because the outcome was positive. It erases the coercion by focusing on the end of the story.
It all worked out in the end, so the beginning doesn't matter.
Right. Strategy 2, emphasize necessity. This is Romulus's main argument. We had to do it to survive. If we didn't steal them, Rome would have died. This frames the aggressor as the victim of circumstance. We had no choice, is the refrain of every tyrant.
Strategy 3, Emphasize outcomes.
Look how great Rome became. Look at the empire. The logic is that the greatness of the result justifies the crime of the origin. If Rome had failed, it would have been a kidnapping. Since Rome succeeded, it was destiny. Success launders the crime.
And strategy 4, silence.
This is the most effective one. What about the women who didn't integrate? The ones who refused to stop crying? The ones who maybe took their own lives rather than submit?
They aren't in the history books.
They are erased. We only hear about the successful ones like Hersilia, who became Roman. The women who didn't fit the narrative were simply written out of existence. We don't even have a precise count of how many women were taken because Rome didn't bother to count them accurately. They were resource, not people.
That is heavy. It really shows that history is written by the winners, in this case, the captors. But bringing this to the modern day, we are in part 7 now. The Roman Empire fell, the temples are ruined, but the rituals survived.
They survived because rituals are sticky. People forget why they do things, but they keep doing them because that's just what you do. It's tradition. The meaning gets lost, but the form persists.
The threshold is the big one we mentioned.
The threshold is everywhere. It survived the fall of Rome, it survived the Middle Ages, it survived the Victorian era when it got its romantic facelift. It is still in Hollywood movies today, and every time it happens, it is a faint echo of that lock clicking shut on a Sabine woman.
And there's another one we touched on, giving the bride away.
That is the direct evolution of the rapio and the later Roman legal concept of manimus. In early Rome, a woman passed from the potesta's power of her father to the manus hand power of her husband. The wedding was the transfer of title.
So when the father walks her down the aisle and hands her over.
It has softened over the centuries. Now we view it as a moment of family support, but originally, it was a transaction. It was the father saying, I relinquish my authority over this person, and the husband saying, I accept authority. It is the handshake between men over the body of a woman.
The Wicked Historian, the source we're using, has this really powerful takeaway about art. They urge us to look at the paintings. You know, you go to the Louvre or the Met, and there are these grand Baroque paintings of the rape of the Sabine women, Poussin, Rubens.
And usually we look at them as aesthetic objects. We look at the muscles, the composition, the colors, we admire the drama.
But if you actually look at the faces of the women in those paintings,
They are screaming. The artist knew. Poussin and Rubens, they read Livy. They depicted the terror accurately. The women are reaching back toward their fathers with desperation. Their eyes are wide with panic. The tragedy is right there on the canvas, staring us in the face. But we have been trained to see it as a mythological scene, a classical trope, rather than a depiction of mass trauma.
their trauma was turned into culture. That's the line that stuck with me.
It's the perfect summary. We took a crime scene and turned it into a gallery exhibit.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave the listener with a thought. We've talked about the threshold, we've talked about the carrying, but how many other romantic traditions are actually just softened reenactments of ancient violence?
That is the question, isn't it? When you see a tradition that emphasizes the passivity of the woman or the taking by the man or a mock struggle, you have to ask, where did this start? And usually if you dig deep enough, you find a Hersilia.
You find a woman screaming for her mother in the torchlight.
And I think the only way to give some dignity back to those 700 women is to remember them as they were, not as founding mothers, not as goddesses, and not as romantic heroines who saved the day with love, but as victims who were incredibly brave, who survived impossible circumstances, and who deserved better. We have to see them as they were, not as Rome wanted them to be.
Absolutely. We have to strip away the marble and the myth and see the human beings underneath.
Thank you for listening to this deep dive. It's a heavy one, but I think it's a necessary one.
Knowledge changes how we see the world, even a wedding, especially a wedding. We'll see you on the next deep dive. Keep questioning the traditions.
Stay curious.